And because there's so many things competing for death, there's nothing wrong with adding GMO to that list.
Oh, Moses Kuria. Hello and welcome. My name is Pete and this is the Nairobist. So today I want to talk about GMOs, a thorny issue that has been on everybody's mind and lips for the past couple of weeks. As we know, the Ruto government decided to lift a 10-year-old, a decade-old moratorium or ban on GMOs. And they're basically saying we are okaying the import and growing of GMOs in Kenya. And as you all know, this has not gone down well with Kenyans, and for good reason too. Why? Because there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of propaganda, I may say, around and surrounding GMOs. So today we're just going to get into it, see what the fuss is all about. What is it really so controversial about genetically modified organisms or GMOs? We're going to get into the facts. We're going to get into the propaganda around it. We're going to get into the economics around it. We're going to get into everything that has to do with GMO. So let's do this. All right. So first of all, like I said, the government okayed GMOs and Kenyans are not having this. But the government is really pushing this. As of today, there is rumored, I don't know if it is confirmed yet, to be that there is a ship that has been docked in the port of Mombasa with I don't know how many millions of bags of GMO maize to be imported into the country to curb the famine due to the drought. All right. Why is GMO so controversial? Why is GMO so controversial? What is GMO in the first place? Like I said earlier, GMO is genetically modified organisms. That means these are organisms whose genes have been engineered from their natural state. So the DNA structure maybe has been altered. And the first point of confusion with GMOs is people always bring up grafting. Why is it so controversial when we've been grafting trees and fruits for a long time, or even crossbreeding animals? Isn't that GMO? Nope, that is not GMO as we know it. That is just selection of naturally occurring breeds to get a superior breed. But GMO has to do with something called transgenics. And transgenics means you're moving genes from one species to another. And that is where the problem is. So we are going to let some experts talk. Let's hear what some experts have to say about this. First, I want us to listen to, I wouldn't call him an expert, but he has a keen interest in this field. And his name is Nassim Taleb, a well-known author, a respected gentleman in the finance field, in the fields of risk and statistics. And this is what he has to say about this.
We look at GMOs. What are we doing with GMOs? We're skipping steps. A tomato, okay, there's a GMO tomato may, according to the FDA, be the same as a tomato that was obtained organically through natural mechanisms or human breeding even. But these steps are not the same as skipping zillions of steps to get to a tomato, you see. We don't know in the soil what's going to do to other plants. We don't know what's going to do to you. We have a lot of unknowns. So when you have a lot of unknowns like that, you put the precautionary principle until further notice. So that's what we're doing.
And I interviewed Greg Page, who's the former CEO of Cargill, and he accepts the idea that there may be some risks, but he as you would argue, doesn't think much about ruin. So his view, and I think the view of many people in the industry and certainly many scientists, whether they're tainted by self-interest or not, they would say, well, look, people are eating these new tomatoes that have, say, the gene of a fish in it or whatever has been done to it, and they're not dying. And it's hard to understand why you would be worried about the fact that there's going to be, say, a mass extinction of human beings from eating a GMO-modified tomato. So what's the scientific evidence?
No, that's exactly what we don't want to avoid. Have to talk about scientific evidence when the burden of the proof is on the GMO people to show us that they understand anything remotely about their tail risk, which they don't. The tail risk is not someone dying from eating a tomato. That's not a big risk. No, that's not a systemic risk. The big risk is what can happen when you have two things going together, which is what happened with the Soviet style is a combination of monopoly of some plants over others. There's too large a system. And of course, creation of other species, that will themselves be also too powerful. And then they may kill the GMOs, or one may kill the other, and you may have huge imbalances in nature. And these imbalances in nature can produce large deviations. This is our point. And we haven't seen any paper looking at the risk from that standpoint. And when people look at risk, we looked at them. Some are using 1960s Kenneth Arrow type reasoning, which of course is not, it's too primitive to allow us to make any conclusion. And when people say, "Where is the evidence?" Tell them, "Hey, what was the evidence that smoking could cause cancer? What was the evidence that lobotomy was bad? What was the evidence that Teldane, Triludan, Seldane, Ecotrin, Lipobay, Baycol, Distilbene, whatever, I don't know how to pronounce them, Vioxx, Ceox, Telodex, all the thalidomide things. Where was the evidence that these were harmful?" Evidence showed up late. You see, sometimes even in one case across the generation. So you have a problem with the reasoning of people, invoking evidence when they don't know what they're talking about as far as evidence. No statistician put a stamp that we have evidence that this is safe. They tell you failure to reject the null at this percentage. And so they sort of agree with us that tail is not investigated. We haven't seen investigation of the tail that's properly done.
But as you point out in the paper, if you're not careful, you can invoke that for lots of things. And you're saying...
Exactly. So we are not invoking. For example, nuclear, we cannot invoke the precaution principle for the nuclear. You see? Why? Because the nuclear will stay local. It doesn't mean it's not risky. You see, you may want to ban nuclear for risk purpose. But the nuclear, you cannot have, a Fukushima cannot destroy, lead to destructions in India, or may in India, but not in Lebanon, you see, or maybe Lebanon, but not Cyprus. So you don't have, but if you have now the same crops invading the whole planet, it's too much. Having GMOs on an island is one thing, and generalizing things to the planet in the name of science is another thing.
Okay, so Nassim Taleb does bring up some interesting points here, and majorly to do with risks, what he terms as global and local risks. So as he says, GMOs can have what we call global risk, which is really dangerous when you have GMOs used globally. GMO seeds used on a global scale. In the event there is some hitch of sorts, then everybody gets affected. All right, you might say there might be some GMOs that are designed to work in a specific place. But even then, in that specific place, in this case locally, when something goes wrong, that entire region gets decimated. So there is some risks that are inherent in these GMOs. I like the idea of how he talks about how nature has bred the tomato for millions, if not billions of years. Whereas if you get a GMO tomato, which has been engineered in a lab within a couple of years maybe, We don't know the risks involved in it. We've not lived long enough to understand the risks involved through those transgenics processes. So there are some really serious issues arising from this, and these need to be these issues need to be dealt with. So we cannot just take up stuff like this that have inherent risks in them without addressing those issues, unless we are just willing to gamble with people's lives in future. So most of these GMO problems have to do with a long enough timeline, and we haven't had that long enough timeline. All right, so the next video is from a lady called Vandana Shiva, and she has been also an anti-GMO advocate for long.
When I watch, not just in India, but in Africa and other parts of the world, now that we have the data that is showing that native seeds have more nutrition, they produce more food, they have no cost because you don't have to use chemicals, that local biodiversity is the way to feeding the world, in spite of all that evidence, in spite of the evidence in the United Nations, in the FAO, in UNCTAD, every agency, Bill Gates is still imposing and forcing GMOs, which is a failed enterprise. And he's not just imposing GMOs, he's taking what has failed and rejected by governments. My government threw the BT aubergine of Monsanto out. Bill Gates resurrects it in Bangladesh. We rejected the golden rice for solving the problem of blindness. He finances it to continue through Philippines. So he's taking all the failed projects with the wrong thinking that life is like a word program and can be chopped and cut and pasted, when it's an amazing complexity of self-organization, and scientists call it autopoiesis, self-organization, writing your own poetry. That's what life does. He is absolutely ignoring all of this new knowledge that new science is giving us and imposing a failed technology with a huge cost to the planet, only so there can be monopolies and people and farmers aren't free to have this.
All right. So what I'm gathering from her is that she's saying that this GMO thing has failed globally. But there are some interests still pushing this. And on the forefront is Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates is an interesting character. And I'm going to go into the works of Bill Gates with vaccines and all these programs that he's been pushing in the third world. But for this particular case, it is quite curious that Bill Gates is so vested in this GMO stuff. Just so you know, Bill Gates is the single largest single largest private landholder in the US. Let that sink in. So there are some really big suspicions when it comes to Bill Gates, but that is a topic for another day. The same Mr. Gates was in Kenya just last week or this week, maybe even. And guess what he was on about? Food security, climate change. So I think she does have a point in this, that the work of Gates, if looked at critically, is not all that entirely benevolent. People need to wake up and really look at the world with clear eyes and critical thoughts.
About creating a sustainability criteria, I think, can also be something of a distraction from a more difficult conversation around safety assessments. And as we look to changing or rewriting the regulations around GMOs, it's important to recognize that we need both. We need to know that any GMOs are sustainable and safe, and if they're not, they simply shouldn't be in the food system.
So this lovely lady from the UK nails the regulation aspect of this. To put it quite succinctly, we need to regulate GMOs in the sense that we need to know whether they are safe or not. If they aren't, they shouldn't find their route into our food system. Period. That's it. Lastly, I'm going to wind up with our local politicians.
Let us understand exactly what GMO is, Mr. Speaker. Our forefathers have been practicing GMO for a long time.
Allah! Allah! Allah.